The year is 1899. The world is watching as tensions on the southern tip of Africa boil over into a conflict that will pit one of the most powerful empires in history against two small but fiercely independent republics. This is the Second Boer War, a brutal and complex struggle fought in a land of vast open plains, rolling hills, and untamed wilderness. But this is no ordinary colonial war. It's a battle of survival for the Boers, the descendants of Dutch settlers who have made this rugged landscape their home. And for the British Empire, it's a fight for dominance and strategic control over South Africa's rich resources, especially its gold and diamonds. So, how did we get here? To understand the Second Boer War, we need to go back to the mid-19th century, when gold and diamonds were discovered in southern Africa. These resources transformed the region from a remote frontier into one of the most economically significant territories in the world. The British, already in control of much of southern Africa, eyed these riches hungrily. But there was a problem. The Boer republics, the South African Republic, also known as the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, controlled much of the land where these resources lay. Though the Boers had no love for the British after years of conflict and uneasy coexistence, they remained fiercely independent. By 1877, Britain attempted to annex the Transvaal, sparking the First Boer War a few years later. Despite their small numbers, the Boers defeated the British at the Battle of Majuba Hill in 1881, forcing Britain to temporarily back down. The republics retained their independence, but a cloud of tension lingered over the region, fueled by mutual distrust. Fast forward to the late 1890s, when the discovery of even more gold in the Witwatersrand region of the Transvaal attracted waves of foreigners, mainly British workers and entrepreneurs, known as Wheat. The Boer government, under President Paul Kruger, placed heavy restrictions on these Wheatlanders, limiting their political rights and imposing high. In London, this was framed as an affront to British dignity and a humanitarian issue, though it's fair to say that the vast wealth of the Transvaal's gold mines was diplomatic relations deteriorated rapidly, and by late 1899, war was inevitable. On October 11, 1899, the Boers struck first, declaring war on the British Empire and launching surprise attacks into British-held territories. For the Boers, this was a war of defense, a desperate attempt to preserve their independence against the might of the British. At first, the Boer forces stunned the British with their skill and determination. Armed with modern Mauser rifles and deep knowledge of the local terrain, the Boers, most of them farmers turned fighters, used guerrilla tactics to great effect. They surrounded and besieged key British garrisons in towns like Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Kimberley. For months, these sieges tied down British forces and dominated headlines back in Britain, where the public was shocked that victory didn't come as swiftly as expected. By early 1900, the tide began to turn. Reinforcements poured in from across the British Empire, swelling the British forces to nearly 450,000 soldiers, a massive advantage over the roughly 88,000 Boer fighters. Under the command of Lord Roberts and Lord Kitchener, the British launched a major counter-offensive. By June, they had captured the Boer capitals of Bloemfontein and Pretoria. Yet, the war was far from over. What followed was arguably its most infamous chapter, the guerrilla phase. Realizing they couldn't win in conventional battles, the Boers faded into the countryside, launching hit-and-run raids and targeting British supply lines. This unconventional warfare frustrated the British, whose massive army found it difficult to adapt to the mobile, decentralized tactics of the Boers. To break the back of the resistance, the British implemented a scorched earth policy. They destroyed Boer farms, burned crops, and confiscated livestock, leaving a trail of devastation across the land. Tens of thousands of Boer civilians, Women, children, and the elderly were rounded up and placed in concentration camps, where overcrowding, poor sanitation, and disease claimed almost 28,000 lives. Black Africans, too, were caught up in the conflict, often serving as laborers for both sides or being placed in separate camps, where thousands also perished. The concentration camps shocked the world and stained Britain's reputation, even among its own citizens. Yet, despite public outcry, the British pressed on, determined to crush the Boers once and for all. By 1902, the Boer forces were exhausted. Their resources were depleted, their land devastated, and their people broken. On May 31, 1902, the war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging. The Boer republics were annexed into the British Empire, but they were promised eventual self-government. So, what was the aftermath of this brutal conflict? For Britain, the war was a costly victory, not just financially, but also in terms of its moral standing. The tactics used during the war, especially the concentration camps, tarnished its image as a civilizing force. The war also exposed weaknesses in the British military and sparked debates about how the empire should be governed. For the Boers, the defeat was devastating, but it did not erase their identity. In fact, it sowed the seeds for a nationalist movement that would later lead to the establishment of the Union of South Africa in 1910 and, eventually, the apartheid system, a legacy that would haunt the region for decades to come. And for South Africa as a whole, the Second Boer War was a turning point. It reshaped the country's political landscape, solidified British control, and set the stage for the deeply divided society that would emerge in the 20th century. Today, the Second Boer War serves as a sobering reminder of the costs of imperial ambition and the resilience of people fighting for their independence. It was a war that reshaped a region, left scars that would take generations to heal, and foreshadowed the challenges and conflicts of a rapidly changing world.